I have the honor to invite the next speaker, Professor Avi Shmida. Professor Shmida is one of the leading botanists in Israel, a professor emeritus in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Human Behavior in the Faculty of Math and Natural Sciences in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, a member of the Center for Rational Research of the university. He has various scientific publications, has read several plant hike Maybe you'll hear from me today. Maybe a couple of different remarks, actually. I don't know almost anything about Humboldt. Giora Simchan gave me as a gift these two books that I read in Hebrew. And you'll probably see a different perspective from me on biology, evolution, and things that relate. I would like to take you today on a journey, let's say, of the connections between evolution, biology, and game theory, but do this through examples and do the impossible, and to begin from the beginning of game theory with the most simple matrix that I know when I'm a botanist that doesn't know math. But since 1986, I have been in Jerusalem with a group that deals with this. And the example that I would, and later on you'll see, to Goethe, how it relates to Goethe and Humboldt and things that I wrote in my lectures 30 years ago and more. They connect one to the next. And the thing that I'd like to begin with is an example that seems maybe trivial. What we see is a palm tree. Maybe you don't know, but tamar and charuv and many other trees as well that are they are a male and a female, and we can see the male plant and you can see the female plant with all its fruit, and the tree is completely the same. You can't tell the difference between a male and female palm tree unless you see its fruit. You see it fruiting, but you have to wait 3 years, maybe longer, until you can see what gender the tree is and how much you can go through in Moab and Edom through the hills there, and you have thousands of trees there, and we count the males and the females, and only then can you get to 50% male and 50% female, meaning a 1-to-1 ratio. And what seems trivial to us, because, 50% female, 50% male, just like in humanity. And I'm sorry for the generalizations and simplifications, 50-50. No, it's not 50. There's more than 50% females among humanity. No, I'm talking big generalizations. But this balance, whether it's plants, animals, the pairing of male to female is 50-50 more or less. So if we look laurel trees in the Galilee, how many male trees and how many female trees, we can see that the ratio is 50-50 basically. And this, now why is it so? The difference is, and anybody who knows genetics and even studied it, you can say, yeah, sure, but they have X and Y chromosomes, and so because of this system, that's why they're 50-50. No, it's exactly not the truth, because in order for there to be 50-50 male-female, an entire genetic system was created of chromosomes X and Y that exactly maintain that 50-50 relation that other forces in evolution, whether on a gene level, individual level, sex level, all egoistically basically take care and assemble in order to create their own interests, meaning create duplications of this gene or this individual more than others. And that is something that we have learned, even you don't need to learn, that seems quite logical. And that's Darwinism. What is adaptive evolution? If you take certain types, genotypes, whether in the population, certain genes, certain individual, is you allow them to compete over a small amount of resources, then the one to survive will the one to have more offspring, and that's an evolutionary answer. I won't go into the definitions, but I'm going to show you it seems so simple, and we use it. 97% of us use it constantly. That's Darwinism. I know what Darwinism is. I assume I know. But no, I had that mistake for 25 years, and I thought I understood Darwinism, and actually it doesn't really matter if it's a species or it's an individual or a gene. What are you talking about? But if you delve into it and you can see the examples, that things are interesting and contradictory. And this palm is a great example of the contradiction, because what's the best for the species is that there be one male and 99% females, meaning one male can fertilize 99% of the females. And anybody who studies will say, yeah, but then you need diversity, genetic differences, you need a diversity in the genotype, you need at least 3 males, and then there's the algorithms of evolutionary mathematics, and we can see that people tend to give some more percentage of male. Then we can see this in cow herds, and we can see this in pigs and sheep. We have 3 bulls for 100 counts, and that is assumed to be what's best by biology. But biology doesn't in fact work like that in nature. And if I simplify things, then today it's clear to everyone, to all the biologists, that this selection works on 5 levels: on the rheumatoid gene, on the individual, on the species, on the population, and on society as a whole, whatever animal or plant we're talking about. And I'm going to present to you one conflict on 2 levels, on the individual level, between various types of individuals, and I will do so by using game theory. The most simple is rules of game theory. Now let us begin with a field that I understand a bit more, pollination. And this is one example which I think is very nice for the enormous gap. I may be sort of being extreme in my language, in my phrasing. Maybe that's my personality, but I'm trying to talk in deterministic terms to show the contrast between the 2 biological approaches, the Goethe approach and the Humboldt approach, and Müller, who was a great pollination. I'm sorry, my teachers talked about this. I didn't hear about Goethe and Humboldt until I was given the book, but this is very famous theories. And on the other hand, we have Adam Smith and Darwin and all of the neo-Darwinists, that if you've studied ecology and evolutionary ecology, you can see that the Fisher, Alten, Hamilton, Axelrod, Trevers, and who was the most famous, who wrote Dawkins. Dawkins was a student of all of those and didn't make any revelations, but wrote a genius book called The Selfish Gene. And what we see are 2 conflicting approaches. And in pollination, we see pollinated fields in Israel, beautiful, lots of gorgeous flowers we have in Israel. And what do we have in the flowers? We have genitalia. And this genitalia in the flowers are on the stem, and this is very attractive. They have sort of a little commercial advertisement for pollinators, for bees and insects, and they have both things, stamen and pollen. And this correlation that bees and insects come, lots of insects, not just bees. Let's take, for example, bees, just as one of them, one of the pollinator families, and we can see this correlation between pollen and bees. We saw this even 3,000, 4,000 years ago. But it was the Germans, the genius Germans, and they were geniuses not only in biology, they made very clear observations, and they were the ones to pioneer through their observations this field. They wrote anecdotal notations. This was a man called Springer in 1792. Amazing how early it was. And he observed bees that come to certain flowers, and he understood that these bees that go between the different flowers are the ones that sex the flowers. They take the pollen particles, the male pollen particles, to other flowers that have eggs that have basically plant ova. And they also connected it to pollen as general, but he didn't know why, because he was a follower of Goethe and Humboldt, and what most of the Germans believed in, they collected. There were many collectors. Most people collected at the time, and they thought, how many new species will they find? And there's a long list that they didn't list at the time, but certainly people who went to the Orient, Boissier, botanists, and Budenheimer, and before that they were zoologists, and Schweinfurt and Kaiser. Lots of people, they were collectors. What would they do? Make delegations, collect lots of plants and flowers, dry them. They like to give them names. Of course, gave them their own names. And then we have a lot of Belotet Kaiser and Uvnat Kaiser from Katerina, and this man was very pleased. What else would they make? Collections, and when they would be paid for these collections, meaning bait nurseries in Geneva or Germany, and Humboldt, by the way, did this as well. Collected and sold collections. So what we see are the observations. This was begun by Spangler. And then after that, at the end of the 19th century, there was a researcher called Muller who wrote 3 books this size about all of the observations of flowers and bees and insects from Umi. And then you can see lists upon lists upon lists of what do you do with the lists? Nothing. And there were many, many such lists of observations in the natural world that were conducted by the German researchers at the time. And in any case, that's how I think of Humboldt and versus. What do we see here? We see here the base for pollination. And the base for pollination is, there's the flower, and there's a bee that comes and pollinates without noticing the bee, while looking for pollen in the bottom, it gets pollen particles, all sorts of particles, and then when it moves on to the next tree and looks for pollen there, it basically creates the fertilization of the flower. And what are we looking for? What is Darwinism? What is adaptive Darwinism and evolution? We're looking for the rules that guide this interaction. Again, I'm simplifying terribly, but if you read Muller's 3 books, and I didn't read Humboldt, I only read one of Humboldt's books recently, but it's a whole list of observations. But we want to know, what are the rules of the game? There aren't any rules of the game. There are just observations. So that's how it was. What do we see? We see bees. And when Springer and all of the other Germans were the very first to describe the pollination process. And we can see a bee collecting pollen. And we can see the morphological signs of all of the bees. And we can see bees, has to be a honeybee, that are adapted to going to lentil flowers. So those that are suited for lentil flowers, they're the ones who take specific pollen, and they're a subset of bees that are dedicated to a subset of flower family, and they're the ones that sit on the very edge of the leaf. Again, I'm simplifying because Muller, when I read his book, it's my Bible, so to speak, because I dealt a lot with this kind of field. Muller also asked these questions of what was the interrelations. He was just as smart as we were, but he never got to the generalization stage. That happened later. So I'm showing you a couple of examples for the fact that the general motto or slogan was harmony, harmony in pollination. And I'm telling you, this is true as an antithesis to the fact that people wanted to know why this happened. Because the bee helps the flower helps the bee, there's an interrelation. The cherub, for example, has its own flowers and it's pollinated by specific kind of bees, and each one helps the other in an interrelationship, and everything works great. But that's no. Adam Smith rejected that view. Darwin rejected that view. They didn't talk about harmony. They talk about every man for himself. It was a war, a battle for resources. Everybody just wants to survive. They just want more offspring, whether at the gene level, the individual level, the genotype level, and so forth. And we have examples here. This is the same morphology that was described very exactly and precisely by the Germans, the collectors. They were very good at systematic observations, creating the morphology and typology of insects and plants. And you have to explain that morphology. And therefore, we saw the development of adaptive evolution principles, what turned into ecology. And we can explain that later on towards the end of the 19th century, 20th century already. And this is another example for why a flower creates pollen to get the bee. But you've asked what the Germans wrote or didn't write. They didn't say that they thought that bees were attracted to the color and the smell of flowers. All of the botany books until the late 19th century, that's what they believed, that bees were attracted to smell and color. And you can see fly traps today that are yellow. Why? Why are fly traps today yellow, sticky fly traps? Who doesn't know this? Everybody sees them. Because flies like yellow. Is that true? Is it true? No, we don't know if it's true, actually. It's not decisive, in fact, at all. So we can see why the flower creates pollen in order to draw the bees. And then the Americans in the 1970s created an entire revolution and showed that bees go to where there's more pollen, not to color, not to smell. Smell and color are just a means by which I can know which flower has more pollen. If a female flower if a female flower can make more pollen than a male flower? And I think that anybody who studied biology in Israel and didn't go through Jerusalem can't know the answer, and they would say the wrong answer. Because I would shock you right now and tell you that there is a different approach to botany, and I'm not the one who invented it. I wish I was. This is known in game theory and adaptive evolution and ecology. That's what we know today in the 21st century. So if the male flower has pollen, and the pollen is protein, right? And the female flower has only an ovary, and it doesn't produce pollen, then everybody wrote, then the female flower created more pollen because there's harmony. Why do birds go there? Bees go there. And then the new ecology principles were developed, and actually the male produces more pollen because the male flower has to have more buds and wants to be, well, more slutty. I'm sorry for being blunt. And if you look to Darwinistic rules, you'll see that if you want more bees and more diversity of bees, you'll have more pollen, and you'll have more bees come to you per flower, and this will pollinate more flowers, create more offspring than your other rivals, which are other flowers. And so actually the female why does it even need to create pollen? It barely does. It just needs a little bit of pollen. It mostly has ovaries. Why? This was from my friend Mazel. Why does the female create so little pollen? Because even the best female flower only needs one flower every 9 months. And then you can see the saturation levels and other measurements that people take. But again, I'm not the one who invented this. This is something that we can see in economic theory and evolutionary theory from the 60s and 70s. We know now that the female doesn't need pollen. Now, why is the bee so hairy? Well, the Germans understood that because it has to gather pollen, and the female bee does gather protein, pollen, in order to create, in order to help the hive. And every single bee is its own unit. 93% of bees are single bees; they're not social. But why would the males be hairy? We saw a male bee, a honeybee here. Look how hairy it is. And the males are hairy. Why do the male honeybees have to be hairy as well? There's no single answer today why they have so many hairs on their legs. Because if they don't, they could be, if they don't gather pollen like the females, then why in the world would they need to have the hairs on their legs? And there's no clear answer for that. We know the morphological signs and traits, but we know that they don't give us every answer yet. And that means that the logic of the why, of the rationale, of how evolution, evolution works, didn't come up from Goethe or from his like and his group, but rather from the English researchers with Darwin, Adam Smith, and afterwards the neo-Darwinists. That was around 1930, with a couple of great UK or British researchers that continued their work in Oxford and in Cambridge. And here, 30 years ago, I don't remember, I didn't, this is Adam Smith and Darwin. And I taught this from 30 years ago. I was taught in Givat Ram, Adam Smith and Darwin versus Goethe and Muller. I didn't know about Humboldt at the time. I apologize. So that's why the male bee is hairy. So all of the Germans will tell you why it's hairy in order to service the flowers. If the flowers are happy, then the bee will be happy. And this is a common interaction of mutual benefit. Then the neo-Darwinists wrote completely the opposite 100 years later. The like Fisher, who was a statistician, and others who were biologists, who researched this. Then there was Alpen. There was an entire group of researchers. There's a great story about Alpen, who they were a communist group of researchers. Alden, that was in the 1930s to the 1950s. They continued the work. And then Meneth Smith was the next to continue that line of research in the 1950s to the 80s. And finally, it was continued by Hamilton and Axelrod. Hamilton, who didn't get his PhD, he was thrown out to the UK, from the UK to America, and he was so amazing in his work that in 1972 he wrote articles that were breakthrough articles, and we're going to see a few of them. And this again all has to do with the term altruism, and we'll take you through the concept of altruism and show you in this story of the why, the rationale behind it, why there are so many deep felt layers of breakthroughs that are a lot more than just, collecting facts and analyzing them. So there's the Darwinist approach, and we're moving on in history because now we're finally talking about our common day examples, and this has to do with flowering. And you can see that there are very clear rules of flowering. We have to sort of think outside the box and be creative when we understand these processes. It's not I found 140 species and this is what I've been doing throughout my life. I've been, classifying and counting species throughout my life. This has been the majority of my career, particularly with colleagues like Daniel Cohen and others, got me out of it and sent me also to study ecology later on. And you can see the generalizations of this market. So I'm not going to get in how many pollen and how much and the length of anatomy of the flower and the bee, but I'll give you another example of the poppy seed. We buy flowers in the store, let's say. And there are hundreds of different kinds of flowers. What have been cultures that are cult flowers, that are for the vase? What other cultured ones can we see? Yeah, obviously, we know what cultured flowers there are that are grown for the industry. We want flowers that are pretty and big and have great presence. We want flowers to keep a long time in a vase, don't we? That's for the industry. What flower keeps throughout a long time? Well, wildflowers. How long does it live? 14 days. Almost 18 days. Most flowers do not live as long as the cyclamen plant, the rakefet in Hebrew. Because then how can you extend its life so much? On the other hand, you have the poppy seed. A poppy seed flower and the cistus flower. They die within a day. Everybody knows they die within a day, but nobody thought about that, the longevity of the plant. So if in your store, let's say you're a flower shop and you're trying to sell flowers, if you get a lot of buyers one day, theoretically, in terms of economics, what's the best thing to do? If you had 300 people in the store every day, close your store at noon and leave. But what do Israelis do? Leave the store open until, at night. This is against game theory, the rules of game theory. So these are one-day flowers. They die within a day, and we can see that lots of people come to them. And if you don't have visitors like the cistus, like the buttercup, you should leave the store open for a long time, meaning leave your flower in bloom for 12 days, 14 days, 18 days. What's the best flower to bloom? Orchids. Orchids don't give you any reward, though. They're a bit, they're thieves in that sense. They don't flower. They don't produce any offspring. If you tie a string around every flower, 3 months they can live. Why? Because nobody comes to them. So you can say that it's a ruse and it's a manipulation and so forth. But the great generalization is that you can create a longevity for a flower by stopping it. So the fewer guests, visitors, pollinators the flower has, the longer its lifespan. And these are a couple of generalizations that exist that we see in the market. So here we have all of this issue that I've described thus far through examples. You can describe it from another direction, from game theory. And the connection, the mediator, is rationality. What do you mean rationality? The basis of economics, Darwinism for me, evolution, adaptive evolution is, if I have two options, right? I'm a bee, and I have two options. I can go to a yellow flower or a blue flower. Which will I go to? Those who give me more pollen. How can I know which will give me more pollen? Well, apparently, bees don't have, or have more nectar, sorry. They don't have built-in preferences, and then one has to see where will they go. Anyway, how can they tell which to go to? How can they tell the difference between the two of them? And we can see through various research studies that we can direct bees to more flowers. What did the Germans write initially? Sure, they like yellow, or they like the ones that have an aroma. But apparently, generally speaking, bees go to any flower that has more nectar. And what's rationality? The basis of rationality is if you have two options, you go to the better one. And if you know and completely understand, you have full information about the two options, about the yellow flower or the blue flower, then you will go to the flower that gives you more nectar, or evolutionarily speaking, you will be able to visit more flowers and create more offspring. Or in game theory, you'll just get a bigger return on your investment. You'll get bigger profits. You'll get more offspring, more profits, more success. theory, in game theory, and all of them, that when you want to, I'm sorry, I don't have a lot of time today to get into the specifics, but you assume that there's full information, that you know everything about the market. But the bee doesn't know if there's more nectar in the yellow or the blue flower. So it has to go and check. It has to sample it, right? Just like research. And practically, you have to sample each flower. But if I have to choose a partner, a wife, a spouse, and I had all information, I don't need to sample. I'd get all of the information ahead of time. I don't need to sample anything. I would know. So while through the visit, I'll go to somebody who gives me more return on investment, more reward. And this is perhaps the foundation, and this began in biology. And I'll give you two examples from the world of biology. I have four famous examples, but I'm only going to give you two. One very famous example from the world of biology by Sobel, that same communist who was a student of the Fisher and Alden group, and he was such a genius and so unique that he was the only one who didn't go to Cambridge and Oxford. He actually created his own, name for himself, in Sussex, and everybody would take their pilgrimage to him. I remember all America would, go to visit him, and they took on this name of the hawk-dove game. Now, this game began from the basic problem that neo-Darwinists had, and that is territoriality. But I'm going to ask you to be, and I try not to be confusing, bear with me. You can see I'm not as organized as the previous speakers, and I hope you bear with me. But we are going to present the dove-hawk game with a 4 Rubik matrix, and I'm going to repeat this several times, okay? For me, it was hard to understand this. It took me 25 years to understand this fully, and I only have a couple of more minutes, so I'm going to try and explain it anyway. What you can see here is a gamer, an actor called the Hawk. That's one line, and they can play a dove or play a hawk. What does that mean? They can attack, meaning be a hawk, or they can be a dove, to be defensive, small, submissive. And here as well, on top, we can see a second player. This is a 2-player game, and each player has 2 options for strategies. So it's a 4 split. That's why it's called a 4 split. 2 players, 2 strategies for each. At the top, the players are identical, but they both have 2 options: either be a dove or a hawk or a dove. Now this is a very well known in chicken fighting. When you play chicken, for example, 2 cars driving fast along a long straight road, and one has to, and we see who goes to the side earlier, or who abandons the car earlier before running it off a cliff, meaning play chicken. And both of them can run off the sides of the road, both of them can bail if they want, both of them can choose to stay in the game, or one of them can do so. Here they're going to play dove. They're going to get 2 and 2. Nobody gets hurt, but everybody slows down. No benefit, no loss. If it's hawk, dove, then he's going to win the battle, the hawk. And those are going to be dove are going to lose. They're going to get 0. If you are hawk, then both of them will come out injured and will both end up with a minus score. So these numbers, and I'll explain what the numbers are, there are various matrices to show this. This shows you the benefit, formally meaning the advantage that you get from playing this strategy or that. And if I'm on the lines, my first compensation is 2 for 5. And that of the second one, that's the columns, they're 2 and 0. Now, the decision to be a hawk or dove you make in the second. It's not that you can negotiate with the other side. Hey, if you're a dove, I'll be a hawk. If you're a hawk, I'll be a dove, or vice versa. No, it's a split-second decision, and it's got. This is game theory, by the way. It got 4 Nobel Prizes, this theory, and I have to say that I'm explaining it in a very sort of roundabout way. So this is the basic game. These were the compensations or the rewards. And here I want to give the same example and repeat it, because for me it was very difficult till this very day. It was difficult, and I want to show you that this is in the palm tree. I'm going back to the palm tree, and certainly in animals as well. Wolves, dogs, cats. Most animals only have 2 pairs, right? Male and female. Here there are 3. Hermaphrodite is the 3rd level. If you think that there's not, no, there are 3 sex types. For example, mushrooms have 7 sex types. Yeast has 80 types of sexuality. So it's possible. But here most of the games are only 2 players, and each has only 2 potential strategies. The first, either a female or a male. This is the second one. They can be either a male or a female. If the second one is a female and the first one is a female, what do you get? 0, 0. You can't have kids with 2 females, right? Those are the facts. This is modelizing the game. It seems simple and stupid, but this is not stupid at all. I assure you. And if we see her on top, we have a male and male, also 0, 0. And there are all sorts of markers for this. The diagonal that goes in this direction leads to 0, 0. And on this other side, 2, 5. And 5, 2. It's symmetrical, this game. So that it's a completely different definitions of a symmetrical game in terms of mathematics, and what is symmetrical in terms of biology. That took another 15 years for me to understand, by the way. So what do we see here? We see that the best is either to be a male, and then my rival is a female, or I'll be a female and my rival is a male. In this case, I get 5. And my rival gets 2. In this case, I get 2 and they get 5. So for me, it's best 5, 2. What is it good for them? 5, 2. So how do we do this? We have to think about it. We barely began. You're telling me 5 minutes. I'm just telling you, for me, of course, it's better to be a male. But if I go from 5, 2, I'll get 0, 0. Meaning I can't talk to my opponent. I can't organize it. And here, if the lady that becomes a female changes from 2, 5, then she'll get 0, 0. So we can't negotiate, we can't coordinate, and nobody would want us to coordinate. And here we see there are 2 solutions, and this is the balancing point, the tipping point. A 2 game that is always there in biology with 2 couples. This is, we see it in graphics. The payment to the first player and the second player. And this is our second example, territoriality. And this is what created the biggest problem of the conflict. That here we see that when there are males that compete for females, what happens is that we can see territoriality. We can see this in birds, we can see this in certain mammals. There's a place in which the males come to battle each other, and what they saw was extraordinary, that the not always the strongest wins, but actually the one with the territory wins. That's where it begins. It begins from this contradiction that territory wins, and from 1930 onwards they couldn't explain it until 1972, 40 years until Mena Smith went to a beer party or a wine party with a girlfriend, and he heard from his friend, a mathematician, who said, look, game theory is Marshall. And from Marshall. And then he remembered that a year earlier, somebody by the name of Price sent him an article of 80 pages that talked about using game theory in evolutionary mathematics and evolutionary calculations. 80 pages. And I can write it to you in one page, by the way. You don't need 80 pages. And it shows you how game theory really can be applied and explained, this most effective matrix that is of the dove hawk, or how we call it through a different principle, territoriality, wins the day. And the calculations and the strategies that are involved, here we see 5-2 or 2-5. And what's the problem with this? That we can run it to the end of the earth. And I agree that the best is the second diagonal, 5, 0, and 0, 5, because the average is 2.5, more than 2.2. So get used to the fact that if this appeals to you, you'll get used to the fact you read it a couple of times, you'll understand it even better than I do. And then the problem is that you can see that it's hard to come together. We can create a commonality, a partnership for this. If we create a partnership, is walking away from the mic, excuse me. I know Tzila, for example. I love Tzila. She's going to be a great secretary. Tzila, are you going to come and do a project with me? We'll be billionaires, sure. But then we begin fighting. I mean, we wanted to be billionaires, but I'm going to get the 30,000 because I'm a manager. And she says, no, I'm the manager. And then we start fighting over the roles. So how did we resolve this fight? The resolution is because in the dove-hawk principle, there's something that's called mixed or combined balance. And this is a half probability for the first line and a half probability for the second line, and it seems very easy that we can balance it out. Nash resolved this in 1951 with game theory, and many people wrote a lot of articles about it, but you need a mechanism that creates a kind of lottery and does a lottery 50-50% of the time, meaning it recreate like a heads or tails flipping the coin, where probability is always 50-50, and this does not exist in biology. There is no 50-50 in biology, and so this principle does not apply to biology. The 50-50 probability equation from 1972 on, yes, this was understood. Let me just say that the differences between male and female and the 50-50 ratio is very big, and happens when there's only two sexual types, two genders, and they're asymmetric, like male and female, where everybody gets different qualities. If they happen to get the same benefit from the interaction, then you can get more than two genders, like yeast, or other species that have 70 different kinds of genders. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Prideaux. I'm going to take 2.
אחד הדברים הכי טובים מתוך ניסיוני רב השנים, אחד הדברים הכי חשובים בכנס זה המפגשים. כלומר, יש כמובן אינטראקציה בין המרצה לבין הקהל, אבל יש הרבה מאוד אינטראקציה בין הקהל. במקרה שאני מדבר עליו, יש אינטראקציה בין מארגן הכנס לבין המרצים. האינטראקציה הזאת מתרחשת עוד לפני הכנס. אבל כדי שתבינו למה אני מתכוון, אני אספר סיפור קצרצר עם 3 פרקים. לפני שנים רבות על רבות, משפחתנו נהגה לצאת, אנחנו, אשתי ואני, אשתי שנמצאת כאן, רינה, ואני, עם הילדים יצאנו לטיולי טבע, וליוו אותנו מדריכי פרחים. הרבה מאוד ממדריכי הפרחים האלה בשנים שונות היו ספרים שנכתבו על ידי אבי שמידה. ולכן את השם, המפגש ביני ובין אבי היה מפגש חד צדדי אמנם, אני הכרתי אותו אבל הוא לא הכיר אותי, וזה לפני שנים רבות. זה פרק א'. פרק ב' קרה כשאני הייתי תלמיד באוניברסיטה העברית בירושלים.
In the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, in the first year of my first day of my second year, we were hundreds of students in the large chem hall, and there were all of the speakers below, and each one with the professors got up and told us what they would teach in the first year. The first one talked about his courses, the second, the third, and then in the middle of the line, a very young guy with a kippah, with a yarmulke, tilted on his side, got up, and after he talked about 5 courses that he's going to teach, not 1 or 2, 5, I decided that I'm going to listen to everything he's going to teach. And that was the man who would become my friend over the years, Israel Oman, one of the Nobel Prize winners that got a Nobel Prize for Economics. And one of the courses that he taught then for the first time in Israel was game theory. He knew game theory prior to coming to Israel. And that's how I got to know him, got to know game theory, and got to know the terminology that Avi was using today and struggled so much to teach us in his class today. And then we get to the third part of the story. The third part of the story was I was looking for Avi, and I thought that he would have something to say about this, and I was looking for him to speak here today because I knew he would object to what would be called, I don't know, the Goethe Humboldt approach. He would go against it. He would give us the counterbalance, and I'm of course not trying to judge between all of these schools of thought, but I spoke to Avi more than once, of course, and I told him that the fact that he does not adopt the view of Humboldt, which was very much influenced by Goethe. They had a 40-year relationship. The fact that he rejects this view doesn't mean he can't speak in my conference. It means he should speak in my conference. Let's hear the other side. Let's hear somebody who's been studying these things for decades and has come to a different conclusion. Now let me go back to the original point. Now, if we've been running, around each other and finally looking for each other, finally managed to connect, and in the phone call that I finally talked to Avi Shmida, that one of the foundations for his view, his philosophy, or in later part of his life, and that happens in nature, in his opinion, that is based on considerations of rationality, game theory, what he called today. And here suddenly we both found ourselves a very fertile ground to talk about a lot of things, and we had a fantastic half-hour conversation, and Avi Shmila apparently was glad that he found somebody to talk to about this, and I was so glad to hear from him how game theory produces such an amazing modality to explain questions and answers of why there are only male and female in most of the natural world. And this is one example how a conference can bring together a meeting and clashing of minds, and it's mutually productive. And this is a story that shows you the first view with Avi Shmida, the second philosophy with Professor Armand, who became colleagues, and of course the third view now we were glad to meet each other here and be introduced to this entire view through the perspective of game theory. And I give you this gift, the 2 first volumes of Cosmos by Humboldt. They're written in English, And I would very much like you to read them. And it says here that I'm glad to give you, as a token of our appreciation for your lecture today and your contribution. Let me just say one thing. The idea that I have the possibility A and B, if I'm given the possibility to play this differently, I can build a strategy in which every time I toss a coin and choose A or B. And this is a third strategy now. And here, when we take these matrices that Avi showed us, and shows us that in next to the other pure views, we can also see a third and try to examine it. We can look at it through all abilities, not only 50-50, 0.1 versus 0.9, and 0.2 versus 0.8, and so on and so forth. And suddenly, we see that in this game of pairings, strategy of 50-50 gives results to both sides, that are better than all other deviations of each one of the particular group or genotype or gender. And so this 50-50 strategy is the most beneficial in terms of the fact that it can be reproduced and multiplied often. But here I've spoken too much. I don't know if I'm reneging on what I said. So thank you very much.